You're the God of covenant, of faithful promises. Time and time again, you have proven you'll do just what you say. Though the storms may come and the winds may blow, I will remain steadfast and let my heart learn when you speak a word, it will come to pass. Great is your faithfulness to me. Great is your faithfulness to me.
Have you ever had anything happen to you, and after it happens, you say, that's not fair? Yeah. Sometimes you might think it happens a lot, but for example, have you ever gone to the DOT and you're sitting there and you go and you take a number, and just say you're number 89. And you're sitting there and you're waiting and you hear them call off number, and finally they call off 88. And when they call off 88, you get really excited because you're 89. And you just know, just in a few minutes, they're going to call your number. After, you already probably need to shave. If you're a guy, you probably need to shave again because you've been there so long, And then you're sitting there and then you hear them call 90. What? 90? What happened to 89? That's not fair. You need to call my number. That's why you take these numbers, right? Anyway, that's not fair. Or maybe you've gone to a restaurant. You ever go to a restaurant and the waitress comes and says, "Hey, what do you want to drink?" And she takes your drink orders, and you say, "Well, we're ready to order because we're kind of in a hurry." And they say, "Okay," and she takes your order, and then she comes back with the bread or the biscuits or the popcorn, just a little appetizer for you as you wait for your food. And you burn through all the appetizer, and you just sitting there, and you notice that some of the people that came in after you are now getting their food. And you're still waiting for your food. And you sit there and you wonder, it's like, what did I order? Do they really have to go out to the stockyard and find that cow and butcher it and bring it? What? Why? What did they order that they so quick and taking so long? And you sit there and you go, that's not fair. Don't they know that there's orders? You should keep order. That's not fair. Well, Habakkuk was in a situation where he'd been praying for his people, and his people in Judah, they have wandered away from God, and he looked around and he saw a lot of injustice. He saw violence. He saw the slipping away of morality. And he was like, God. And he was praying for the people, and he was saying, God, do you not hear? Do you not care about your people? Can you do something to bring these people back to the Lord? Can you bring us back as a nation where we wholeheartedly serve you? And as Habakkuk prayed that prayer, God finally answered Habakkuk. And in verse 5, he says, look at the nations. Now this is God talking to Habakkuk. He says to Habakkuk, look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if I told you. Man, doesn't that sound exciting? God's going to do something. And now Habakkuk doesn't think God's been doing anything. So for Habakkuk to hear this news, it's like, wow, God's going to do something. And I'm going to be amazed. I'm going to be excited. And then God tells Habakkuk what he's going to do. I'm going to use the Babylonians. What? Did I hear right? You're going to use the Babylonians? What are you talking about? God's answer creates a problem for Habakkuk. Yes, Judah is sinful and unrepentant, but the Babylonians are even worse. How can God use a more wicked nation to judge a less wicked nation? In the first section, Habakkuk struggled with the problem of evil in the world. Now, in the second section, he struggles with the problem of God's justice. When confronted with the problem of evil, Habakkuk questioned, does God care? When confronted with God's judgment for sin, Habakkuk has a new question. Is God fair? What people don't realize is that the second question answers the first. Yes, God is loving. God cares about evil in the world. And the reason we know this is because God will in fact judge evil and sin in the world. And he'll judge all evil and all sin in the world. God is both loving and just, which is another way of saying that God cares and God is fair. Habakkuk's situation was a little different, though. Habakkuk wasn't questioning God's right to judge sin. He was questioning his method. How could God use the Babylonians to judge the people of Judah? The Babylonians were even more wicked than the people of God. Wouldn't it make more sense to judge the Babylonians? Was God fair? And so this morning we want to look at Habakkuk's complaint, and we want to look at then God's response. And basically Habakkuk's complaint is this: because he was using the Babylonians, God, what are you doing? Are you fair? Is that fair to use a more wicked people to judge not a righteous people, because they weren't righteous, but a better people? And so that was his complaint. And so we're going to look at Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 12. It says this: O Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, we will not die. In this verse, verse 12, Habakkuk acknowledges that God is forever. He is above time. He was before the world was created, and he will be there after the world has ended. And with that, he is over the world. He is over then the nations of the world. He raises a nation up, and then he will tear a nation down. God is sovereign over all of the earth. But notice, Habakkuk acknowledges that, and then he says, yet we will not die. He knows God's going to use the Babylonians to punish the nation of Judah. But in this, he declares that we will not die. How can he make that declaration? Well, he makes that declaration because he knows that God is a covenant-following God. God made a covenant with Abraham that as long as the earth is around, the descendants of Abraham would be a people and a nation. In Genesis chapter 17, verse 5, it says, no longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham. For I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant before me, and you and your descendants after you, for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you are now an alien, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 11 says this: I am with you and will save you, declares the Lord. Though I completely destroy all the nations among which I scattered you, I will not completely destroy you. I will discipline you, but only with justice. I will not let you go entirely unpunished. And so what he's saying that God, Habakkuk knows these promises. He knows that God is a covenant-keeping God, that God had made a promise to Abraham. He also made a promise to the descendants of Abraham that God may punish them, but he's never going to destroy them as a nation. And here we are thousands of years later, and there's still a little sliver of land that we call Israel today. And yes, they have their enemies, and I don't know how many hundreds, thousands of missiles have been launched at Israel, and yet they live. They're unaffected. because God is protecting him. That is one stretch of land that will always be known as Israel, because God will not break his covenant. Now, America doesn't have a covenant like that with God. God could bring our enemies in and wipe us out if we don't follow God and obey God and keep his promises, his word, his law. He'll raise us up. He'll tear us down. He's done it with many nations of the world. There were many nations in time of Habakkuk that don't even exist today because God completely tore them down, rooted them up. They're gone forever, but not Israel. And so Habakkuk can say, we will not die. Even though the Babylons are coming against us, we will not die. We will be disciplined, we will be punished, but we will not die. The second part of the verse then, Habakkuk firmly believed that God was sovereign over the nations of Israel, but then he also believed that God was sovereign over all the other nations as well. Look at the second part of verse 12. It says this, O Lord, you have appointed them, that's the Babylonians, to execute judgment. O Rock, you have ordained them to punish. Habakkuk believes that God is telling him, he believes that God has sent Babylonians to attack Judah and punish them. That God has appointed the Babylonians to discipline the people of Judah. First thing that Habakkuk was convinced of was that God was sovereign over the nations. And that God would even use a wicked people to try to straighten up his chosen people, the people of Judah. So first, Habakkuk is convinced that God is sovereign over the nation. The second thing that Habakkuk is convinced of is that God is holy. Verse 13, your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrong. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up the more righteous than themselves? This is one of the clear teachings in Scripture. God is absolutely holy and pure. 1 John 1:5 says, God is light, in him there is no darkness at all. It means that God is perfectly holy, righteous, and pure. There is no evil, sin, darkness in him at all. But Habakkuk goes even further here in verse 13. Not only is there no darkness or evil in God, his eyes are too pure even to look at evil. This does not mean that God turns his head and does not see evil or ignores evil. It means that when God sees evil, he never approves of it. When we see evil in the world, sometimes we just dismiss it or feel helpless and think, well, what can I do about that? I can't do anything. There are even sometimes we might even think, well, that's what that individual had coming to him. So sometimes when evil comes to a person, we're kind of even like, well, good. Not so with God. God has only one reaction to sin or evil. He is offended. All sin is a direct offense to God's holiness. God is holy and is offended by sin. God cannot tolerate sin. If it wasn't for God's mercy and grace, we would all be destroyed. But because of his mercy and grace, God offers us forgiveness instead. This is why in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 21, it says, test everything. Hold on to the good. Avoid every kind of evil. So if God is holy and cannot look on sin, why does he tolerate and even use treacherous people? Habakkuk is struggling with what he knows about God and his purity and what God has told him about the Babylonians and how wicked and treacherous they are. And yet God is using them. It's kind of like Habakkuk saying, God, I know, I've been praying, I've been asking you, God, do something, because our people are wicked. Morality, there's hardly any. As far as people who want to worship you and honor you, they don't. So God, do something. But God, you say you're going to punish us, or I like to say discipline. So God, you're going to discipline us. And Habakkuk is saying, okay, God, I don't mind the discipline, but don't use that stick. Could you use something else? Don't use the treacherous Babylonians. But God is sovereign, and God knows what he's doing. So the first thing Habakkuk is convinced of is that God is sovereign over the nations. The second thing that he is convinced of is that God is holy. And the third thing that Habakkuk is convinced of is that the Babylonians are bad people. Habakkuk is convinced of these three things. Verse 14 says this: "You have made men like fish in the sea, like sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them on his dragnet. And so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys choicest food. It is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy." So now Habakkuk gives an illustration, and he uses this fishing illustration about the Babylonians were like fishermen who throw their nets into the water, and as the net goes in the water, it catches, fish get caught up in the net, and they pull the net out, and they have this massive catch, right? And then they take these fish and they sell them, and then they buy what they want, and they live in luxury, right? They live with much because what? Because they've captured these poor fish. And Habakkuk is saying, God, the Babylonians are like the fishermen. I don't know if you guys have ever gone paddle fishing. No one? Okay, a couple of you. All right, and paddle fishing is done in North Dakota and Missouri River up by Williston. And what they do is they throw basically a hook in the water. Normally when you go fishing, you bait your hook, right? And you try to get the fish hungry fish to bite onto whatever your bait is, but hidden in that bait is a hook. And you hook them and you pull them out of the water, right? In this case, paddle fishing, you don't bait your hook. You just throw your hook in the water and you reel it in and you hope to hook a paddlefish. Now, can you imagine just being a paddlefish? You'd have a real big long nose, but just be a paddlefish and you're swimming upstream and you're enjoying life. And all of a sudden, snag, you get hooked. Now you resist, but the person on the other end is stronger than you, and they literally pull you out of the water. And you're like, as a paddlefish, I didn't want to go there. I enjoy my water. I enjoy my life. What are you doing? I don't want to come visit you. I'm not interested in one thing about humans. It was funny. Yesterday we got the state parade, and it was the best part about it was a good parade. But one of the best parts about it is Stephanie said, "Hey, look at the giraffe." And the giraffe was standing behind the wall with his head over the wall, looking at the parade as it went by. And he was probably thinking, "Look it, there are people watching people instead of people watching me." You know, what's going on? You know, it was just the cutest thing. It was funny. Anyway, but hey, the fish, the paddlefish, getting pulled out of the water. They weren't interested in looking at us like the giraffe was interested in like what's going on out there. They're just like, well, we want to go back in the water. We're going to die out here. Same with, it's the picture of the Babylonians. What would the Babylonians do? Against the will of the other nations, their neighbors, they would just go out and they would make war with them, and they would drag off possessions. They would drag off their gold. They would drag off their food. They would drag off their people. They would go in. We know this because of the story of Daniel, right? Daniel was one of those who was captive by the Babylonians and taken off to Babylon. Did he want to leave his homeland? No. But he was good looking, he was smart, he was young. They wanted to bring him in, and they wanted to learn from the other nations. They wanted to improve themselves. And they did that by stealing the smartest and the brightest. And Habakkuk is having a problem with that. And the reason he's having a problem with that is because they were wicked people. The Babylonians were wicked. The Babylonians were evil. They worshiped their net, which was their own strength. They didn't treat other nations with respect or kindness. They said, the world is ours. Habakkuk is aware that God has raised the Babylonians up. God is the one who has given the Babylon its power and strength. Babylon does not acknowledge that God is doing anything. They only brag on what they have done by their own power and their own strength. They are very prideful people. Habakkuk doesn't have a problem with any of these three things individually. He knows that God is sovereign over the nations. He knows that God is holy and cannot tolerate wrong. And he knows that the Babylonians are wicked, yet they're being used by God. He is convinced that all these three things are true. He just cannot see how all three can be true at the same time. For example, if God were not sovereign, then God could not stop Babylon. And so Babylon's success would not raise any question. If God were not holy, he would not care about the Babylonians' wickedness. And so that would also remove the problem. Or if Babylon was good and prosperous, then he could see God blessing them. But they're wicked, and yet they're prosperous. And that creates a problem with Habakkuk. The problem for Habakkuk is all three of these conditions exist at the same time. He knows God is sovereign. He knows God is holy, and he knows that Babylon is wicked yet prosperous. It doesn't make any sense to him. It makes him question God's justice. It makes him wonder, is God fair? And so when we get to this point, what does Habakkuk do? What does he do? He's struggling here. He's convinced of these three things about God and his world, and they don't seem to fit together. And so he's struggling. When you see things in your world and you're convinced of things, and yet those things don't fit together and they don't seem to fit with God, then what do? What can you do? You do what Habakkuk does. He goes to God looking for the answer. Habakkuk looks to God for the answer. Notice here that God doesn't stop seeking God. He doesn't abandon God. Instead, he presses in. He if you would, complains a little more. He seeks a little harder. And he asks, God, give me an answer. Then he waits for the answer. So many times today I see individuals who, they look around at the world and they find things that just don't seem to make sense. And they say, well, that's not fair, or, God doesn't care. And the first thing they do, they get angry at God and they just walk away. Well, if God's going to be like that, then I don't think I want to be around that kind of a God. And they just walk away. They don't look for answers. They don't press in. They don't seek more. They just get angry and walk away. Don't do that. Do what Habakkuk does. Press in. Seek harder. God wants our questions. He doesn't even mind if we're mad when we're asking him. But he wants us to ask. He wants us to press in. He wants us to seek him. So what does Habakkuk do? He presses in. Habakkuk says, I will stand at my watch station myself on ramparts. I will look to see what God will say to me. What answer will come? See, that's what you need to do. You just need to knock. Yeah. You need to seek, right? What an illustration. And if we don't respond, they'll probably knock again, and they might knock harder. That's what we're supposed to do. So in the next, as Habakkuk knocks, as he seeks God, as he presses in, God gives him an answer. Then the Lord replied, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of an end and will not be proven false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. See, he is puffed up. His desires are not upright. But the righteous will live by faith. Indeed, wine betrays him. He is arrogant and never at rest, because he is greedy as the grave, and like death is never satisfied. He gathers to himself all the nations and takes captive all the peoples. And so finally, this is what we were waiting for, right? We were waiting for God's response. We were waiting for God's reply. And the first thing that God says is this: Habakkuk, write it down. Write it down. It's interesting, so many times, I don't know if you've ever experienced like a prophetic word over you, or maybe in prayer felt like God has said something to you, and you're like, okay, I got it, and then you leave that and you don't write it down. The problem with that is you may forget. Sometimes God will say, give you a word or speak something over your life that isn't going to happen just in the next week. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it takes a while, okay? In the case of Habakkuk here, this is going to take years to play out. And so they need to write it down. They need not to forget it. I like the testimonies I've heard is that sometimes people have had a prophetic word spoken over them, and at the time they're like, wow, I don't even really know what that means. But then they go out and they live their life, and then a few years, and they wrote it down. And a few years later, they'll come back and they discover what they had written, what had been spoken over them, what had been prophesied over them, and they'll read it and they go, wow, that's exactly what happened. And it's just like, man, it amazes them that God actually knew in advance. They were struggling, and it didn't make them living it out any easier. But as they look back, they're like, yeah, God knew, and I can see God's hand there all the way, all along. And so it even gives them more confidence in God. So when you get a word from the Lord, maybe you won't even understand it fully, but write it down. Because God's answer is for an appointed time. Okay, and that's what it says here. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. So sometimes, that appointed time may be, in the next few days. Sometimes it could be years from now. So God speaks. God sees into the future way beyond what we can see. He knows way beyond what we can know. And if he gives you a word, it's important to write it down. And sometimes write it in a place where you can review it and see it. And many times you'll see it unfolding. So the next thing we see here is that, the problem that Habakkuk was having was this wicked people were going to judge Judah, which was supposedly a godly nation, okay? And the godly nation that had drifted. But how could those wicked, treacherous people be the ones to discipline and be used by God? And he struggled with that. And so this is what God says now about the Babylonians. See, he is puffed up. His desires are not upright. but the righteous will live by faith. Indeed, wine betrays him. Again, this is the Babylonians. He is arrogant and never at rest, because he is greedy as the grave, and like death is never satisfied. He gathers to himself all the nations and takes captive all the people. It is true that God uses the Babylonians to judge Judah, but God does not excuse sin. Therefore, the Babylonians will be judged for their sins too. The Babylonians were puffed up, unrighteous, arrogant, drunkards, and greedy. Babylon conquered nations, not out of concern for God's justice, but because of their own arrogance and greed. Babylon is drunk on power and wine, and his drunkenness will betray him. Part of the prophecy that is given in Habakkuk was fulfilled in Daniel chapter 5, when the Babylonians were destroyed by the Medes and the Persians. So just a little refresher on Daniel chapter 5. You guys remember when the Babylonians were having a great party? And I mean, they were, it was a grand party, right? And all of a sudden, as they were partying, there was a hand and started writing on the wall. And nobody knew what it meant. So they ran and got Daniel. And Daniel told them what it was. He could read that. And it was a very clear statement that this very night, they were going to be destroyed, the Babylonians. Now, they were a superpower. They had conquered nations. They were proud of themselves. They had strength. But what did it say? They were puffed up and they were drunk. And in their drunkenness, God raised up another nation, two other nations, to come in and destroy them, to judge them for all their wickedness as well. So God used them to kind of straighten out the people of Judah, to bring their attention back to God. But God didn't ignore the sins of the Babylonians. In fact, there came a day that they were judged and they were punished as well. So when you see this, sometimes it's like, well, God, can you do that? Can you really do that? That's not fair. God has a timeline that's not our timeline. And God has a way of disciplining that's not our way. And when it comes, we just have to trust him. And the good news here is that what? The righteous will live by faith. It almost seems to be misplaced in that verse. But there's a clear distinction between the way the world lives and the way a righteous individual lives. The world, they go after things that please themselves. They're looking for power. They're looking for things that puff themselves up. But the righteous, they're seeking after God's way. They want to know God. They want to have his answer. They want to have his direction. They want to follow him because ultimately they trust God. God, what are you doing? God is there to give an answer. God is there to help us sometimes understand. Now, there's some questions that we'll never understand until we get to heaven. But if there are things that we need to know, he will let us know. He will explain them to us. Habakkuk was reminded that God has everything under control. Remember, God is sovereign. Habakkuk just had to put his faith in God, who is holy and just. There are times in our lives when we look around and feel like it seems like God isn't fair. But wait, God is fair. I just looked through the Old Testament, and there are things that you go through, and sometimes you could look at the things you go through and then look over at your neighbor and say, well, they're not going through that. That doesn't seem very fair, God. But God knows what he's doing. Look at Joseph's life. I mean, his brothers got to stay home, hang out with dad. What happened to him? He got sold into slavery and put in prison. And then finally God brought him out of prison and put him in second in command of the country. And God used that. Now, that seemed fair. God had a purpose. God had a plan. And sometimes his ways are not easy. Sometimes his ways maybe don't even feel fair. But if we keep on trusting him, like Joseph, like Habakkuk, keep on trusting him, in the end, we'll say, God never failed me. All my life, he's been faithful. All my life, he's been there to help me. Sometimes maybe it wasn't easy, and he took me the hard way. But I don't think in the end we're going to look back and say, well, that's not fair. We look at the cross. We look at Jesus. God so loved us that he sent his one and only Son, that whoever believeth in him should not perish but have eternal life. Jesus could say, well, God, Father, Dad, I don't want to go there. That's not fair, right? But we also know that Jesus didn't just get sent. He agreed to go. Because what did Jesus say? He said, I willingly gave up my life. I looked at Jesus like a soldier. You know, soldiers get recruited. And Jesus was maybe recruited by his dad. Hey, God's like, hey, Jesus, I got a plan. Hey, son, I got a plan. My plan is, you ever think about being a human? Being born like a virgin? Live down there for, 33 years and then get crucified and die. But good news is we'll just raise you right from the grave again. And Jesus said, sign me up. Sign me up. Yeah. But with an ending that was powerful, right? He surrendered. It'd be no different than a soldier going off to war. They don't know if they're going to have to give their life. Many of them do. There are times like Normandy, that was like a suicide mission. It's like, go get in this thing. You're gonna go to the shore. Well, I don't want to go to that shore. They're shooting at me. I'm gonna die. And you can see all the blood in the water and all their friends that have died, and yet they still go forward. That's what Jesus did for us. And that's part of God's plan. God made him, that is Jesus, who had no sin, to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Romans 1 verse 16, it says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for salvation of everyone who believes. First for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For in the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed. A righteousness, that is by faith from first to last. Just as is written, the righteous will live by faith. What is God taking you through right now? Are you going like, God, that's not fair? Trust him. Put your faith in that good shepherd. Let him lead you. Let him guide you. Try not to compare your situation to others, because maybe sometimes it seems not very fair. But God's got victory in store for you. He's got victory in store for every one of us who completely put our faith in him. Habakkuk, he stated this earlier, we will not die. We will not die. Oh, the Babylonians are coming, yeah, but we're not going to die. God's got us. No matter what we go through, kind of like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in front of the king. Well, we know a God, our God, he's able us to rescue us out of the fire. But if he doesn't, we're still going to live for him. Their faith was in God. No matter what they go through, no matter what happens, their faith is solid. We're going to trust God. Whatever God does, he's got us. Because ultimately, we may die physically, but we're not going to die spiritually. In fact, we're going to go to live with God forever. So let me ask you, is your faith in God firmly planted no matter what happens? Even if he uses, let's just say, the Chinese to destroy America, is our faith still going to be in God? Could I say, even if he uses the Canadians? I knew you guys would laugh. Just an enemy. But that's what Habakkuk was facing. God using wicked people to straighten up the righteous. What happens if he uses maybe an ungodly neighbor, to get you to say, you know what, I really need to be more sold out to God. That may happen. Let's let it happen, right? Let God help us to be all we can be for him.